Hello, everybody, and good evening. Welcome to our first science talk of the 2021-2022 season. It's going to be a really interesting talk tonight. I want to welcome you here to the Wayne for this, Jenna, fifth season? Fifth year we've been doing this probably? Yeah, so you want to tell your friends and neighbors and your students and grandchildren that they really want to come to these events because there's some really great information that we're providing here, and it's really interesting. It's a great series for the local community. Before we get started, I wanted to first talk about the programs that are coming. So tonight is the insect apocalypse. On the 12th of October, we've got a subject will be the new discoveries regarding archaeology of the South River region. That's going to be presented by Dr. Carol Nash, who is a JMU Associate Professor of Integrated Science and Technology. That's very interesting. She's got some great information about early settlement and some of the really first peoples in this region. That'll be an interesting talk to learn about the local area here. And then on the 16th of November, we're going to have an update on the mussel restoration project here on the South River. I don't know if you remember, maybe 2 years ago, Dr. Jess Jones had came and talked about Virginia Tech had received a $2.5 million grant as part of the DuPont NERTA settlement to restore the mussel restoration here on our South River. That project has now started, so we're going to get an update on that. And that was one of the more interesting topics I think we've had here. I was really fascinated by it. I learned a lot that evening. And that's going to be presented by Dr. Brian T. Watson, who's an aquatic resource biologist and the state malacologist, which is a branch of zoology that deals with study of mollusks. So thank you, Jenna, for these good notes, because that was something I was not aware of. Yeah, it's interesting. So we'll have no program in December. We always take the holidays off. And then January, we're working on some stuff. For February, we're targeting a talk on vernal ponds. There's some amazing network of vernal ponds in this local area, and there's a fellow that's doing a wonderful photographic depiction or kind of analysis of these things, and some of the photographs are fascinating. That's going to be an interesting conversation. And then we've got a couple of folks we're still trying to confirm for March and April. So our series this year is going to be, I think, really exciting. So you're seeing up here some of the slides from our pre-planning of the Virginia Museum of Natural History Waynesboro campus. You probably have heard, but if you haven't, we actually secured funding for the next phase of this project, which is to actually go out and develop detailed planning. So we've secured funding to issue an RFP to line up both a design architect and an exhibit architect to develop the detailed plans for this project here. These images are from the pre-planning study. Now the next step of this project will be to get into the real meat of it and to make sure that the level of detail will ensure that the exhibits, facilities, and the building will meet the needs of the museum and the programs. That process, which is just starting now, we're actually going out with an RFP to solicit these architects. This will go on through 2022, and then at the conclusion of that project, then we go back to the General Assembly and request funding for the actual building. So the process is happening, but it's still another 18 months out. Stay tuned to some notices over the next 18 months of public hearings or public meetings where we're going to be doing some visioning sessions. So if you'd like to participate in some of that, keep your eyes open, ears and eyes open to come and participate in helping us go through some of the detailed exhibits. And lastly, I want to thank the City of Waynesboro, CCR, the Virginia Museum of Natural History Foundation for getting us to where we are. This project's been being worked for about 10 years, and if it wasn't for the support of all those folks, we wouldn't really be where we are right now. So it took a lot of time and effort and a lot of great volunteer work. And I also want to thank our sponsor, which is the South River Science Team for these events, which provides financial support for allowing our guest speakers to come up and do these programs for us. So let me introduce our next speaker for tonight. He's going to get into more detail, but give you a little bit of background on him. So Dr. Art Evans is an author, lecturer, and photographer He received his PhD in entomology at the University of Pretoria in 1988. Since then, he has authored several books, including most recently The Beetles of Western North America, not to be confused of the book on the Beatles from Liverpool, England. For many years, he hosted What's Bugging You on WCVE FM radio. Art currently serves on the Board of Trustees for the Virginia Museum of Natural History, where he chairs the Research and Collections Committee. He resides in Richmond, but travels extensively in search of beetles and other creatures in support of his research and writings. And thank you, Art, for making the trip tonight, and I'm going to hand it over to him.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. I've got to get situated in this room to figure out how I can see the slides and then relay the information to you. The title of tonight's presentation is The Insect Apocalypse, and I raised the question, is the world's entomofauna in decline? As you heard, I wear a lot of hats. I'm a trustee and a research associate with the Virginia Museum of Natural History. I've been involved with the museum for 20 years as a research associate. I'm also a research associate at the Smithsonian in the Department of Entomology, and also the California State Collection of Arthropods, which is associated with the California Department of Food and Agriculture. I'm originally from Southern California. I'm an adjunct assistant professor at Randolph-Macon College, the University of Richmond, and the Virginia Commonwealth University, and I teach several courses in entomology for biology majors as well as non-science majors. I earned my doctorate, as you heard, from the University of Pretoria in South Africa, chased African scarab beetles for 3 years, had the time of my life. I've always had a strong interest in informal science education, and I stepped back from doing research and helped develop the fourth insect zoo in the United States. This is back in the late 80s. Insect zoos are very common now, it seems, but there were only 3 when I came back home from South Africa, and I started the 4th one at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles. I moved to Richmond in 2000, and I work primarily as an entomologist and an educator, lecturer, author, photographer, consultant, and radio broadcaster. I love what I do. As an entomologist, I get to do all kinds of things. I get to work with all kinds of people. Again, I've said that I have a strong interest in informal science education, so I'm working with students out on the field. I'm also had a radio segment on Richmond Public Radio called What's Bugging You that aired during Morning Edition. And also, when I have time, I try to do a little bit of research too. I'm particularly interested in scarab beetles. The program I did was with my co-host Steve Clark. We recorded over 400 of these 3-minute-long segments, and it ended a few years ago with Steve Clark's retirement. I got a chance to introduce people to all aspects of insects and entomology, and my target audience was people that really don't think much about insects, but they're open enough to learn something new. In my experience, I've always found that there are 2 kinds of people. There are those that love insects, and there are those that don't yet know they love insects. So I'm guessing most of you are in one of those 2 categories. But I also dragged a lot of my friends and colleagues into the studio or talked with them through the magic of technology. You might recognize some of the faces here. Amy Stewart, very well-known author. David George Gordon, who's a well-known author, and Bug Chef, if you've ever enjoyed tasting insects and other arthropods. I'm sure nearly all of you are probably familiar with Doug Tallamy's work, and I'll certainly mention some of his work later in the presentation. Recently, we took 6 segments of What's Bugging You and then turned them into an animated video series. And this goes under the guise of I'll try anything once. And I've been involved in insect projects over the years for popular consumption, and sometimes they've made me cringe. This is not one of them. I'm very proud of this. If you have an opportunity to go to VPM's website and look up What's Bugging You, we have 6 of these animated episodes, and they're a lot of fun. And I think you'll enjoy them, and I'll think your children and grandchildren might get a kick out of them too. Pardon me. I'm the author, editor, and contributing writer of a number of books on insects. My specialty is beetles, so that's what I write most about. And as was mentioned earlier, my most recent publication, which just came out a few weeks ago, is Beetles of Western North America, published by Princeton University Press. This is a companion volume to Beetles of Eastern North America that I published 7 years ago. And both of these books are widely available through your favorite booksellers. When I first became interested in education and informal science education, using insects as a vehicle, one of my heroes was E.O. Wilson, Edward Osborne Wilson, a very famous scientist from Harvard, Ant-Man, world-renowned scientist. He's been called the new Darwin, 2 times Pulitzer Prize-winning author. I consider to be fortunate to have managed to bump into him twice and had one-to-one conversations with him, once at the Atlanta airport, just me and Dr. Wilson chatting about writing books and insects, and it made my day and then some. But he wrote a very influential book for me called Biophilia. And this was back in the early 80s, but in short, his hypothesis was that human beings have an innate tendency to focus on life and lifelike processes. And of course, this manifests itself in how we live, how we go about our lives, how we treat the environment, for better or for worse, how we design buildings, how we take care of those spaces inside buildings, and how we surround ourselves with bits of nature. And he wrote that if all mankind were to disappear, the world would regenerate back to the rich state of equilibrium that existed 10,000 years ago. If insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos. This is a pretty strong statement, and I think it's worth taking a look at to see what would compel him to say such a thing. If we look at the importance of insects in terms of the products and services they provide, in other words, we're looking at it through our myopic viewpoint of the world. What's in it for me? What do they do for me? Pollination certainly tops the list, pollinating crops, and of course honey and wax. These services are provided by European honeybees. They serve as biological controls. In other words, there are species that are predators, parasitoids, and herbivores of plants and animals that we consider to be pests, and we can use them instead of pesticides or in addition to pesticides to control them. Silk production. There's just one caterpillar that we've been keeping in cultivation for over 6,000 years to get silk. It's interesting to note that silkworms are the world's only completely domesticated insect. You will not find them in the wild. Dyes and shellac, produced by cochineal and lac scales. If you're not familiar with scale insects, they're very bizarre. They have bizarre natural histories. The mature females look very un-insect-like, but they're not so distant cousins of aphids and mealybugs, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And of course, insects are a tremendous source for drugs or for compounds that we can develop into drugs. For the last 300 million years, insects have evolved different strategies and means of protecting themselves. And in doing so, they have evolved these chemical compounds that serve as antibacterials, antivirals, antifungals, antineoplastics, cytotoxins, neurotoxins, and vasodilators, all of which have properties that we value, and many of them show promise in being used as treatments for human ailments. The scientific value of insects is enormous. They serve as taxonomic and systematic models. They help us to understand and develop hypotheses as to the evolutionary relationships of not only insects, but other organisms. Because they're so incredibly diverse and they have all these wonderful characteristics that can be analyzed and compared, we can test models and then use those very same models to look for evolutionary relationships of other organisms and even fossil organisms, such as dinosaurs. They help us understand mimicry and mimesis and other evolutionary adaptations. They serve as study subjects for illuminating species interactions, genetic principles, and natural selection. Think of the lowly, obnoxious fruit fly that's hovering around your fruit bowls right now at home with those little pink eyes. That is the most intensely studied animal on the planet. Since the 1920s and the 1930s, they've been studied, and thanks to their study, we have been able to develop techniques not only to study genes and chromosomes and their interactions, but also how to manipulate those genes and chromosomes and to discover and share the human genome and way beyond. It all started with pea plants and fruit flies. And finally, they serve as anatomical inspiration in the really amazing field of biomimetics. Biomimetics is the idea of, rather than reinventing the wheel, why not look at nature and see the way nature has solved problems through the millennia, through the course of evolution, and then apply those principles or those inspirations to technological designs that make our lives better. Okay, so I've shared some of the things that make insects incredibly useful from our point of view. But let's step back. Let's step back and look at what they do for the environment, for the ecosystem at large. They're involved in nutrient recycling via leaf litter and wood degradation, dispersal of fungi, disposal of carrion and dung, and soil turnover. They're involved in plant propagation via pollination and seed dispersal. They help maintain plant community composition and structure via phytophagy. That's a fancy way of saying that plant-feeding insects, herbivorous insects, exert an enormous amount of pressure on plant species in different communities and ultimately decide the winners and losers in those communities. They shape not only the structure but also the species composition of plant communities. On the opposite side of that coin, they are involved in the maintenance of animal community structure through disease transmission in larger animals and predation and parasitism of smaller ones. They're tremendous predators. They're also carriers of disease-causing pathogens. Think of mosquitoes, for example. Mosquitoes are probably the most, well, I won't say probably, they are the most dangerous animal on the planet, at least from a human perspective, because of the potential they have for carrying disease-causing pathogens. And finally, they give themselves up as food for insectivorous vertebrates. When I ask my students, give me an example of an insectivorous vertebrate, right away somebody says anteater, which is a perfectly legitimate example. But then I ask them to think of examples that are closer to home, and that's when you start thinking, oh, bats, fish, reptiles, other insects, spiders, and even birds. Now, as adults, birds feed on all kinds of things depending on the species. They're seed eaters, they're fruit eaters as well. But when they are raising their chicks, those chicks are 100% dependent upon protein in order to grow quickly. And that protein is in the form of insects. And I'll come back to that point later in the presentation. A few years ago, there was a paper published on the economic value of the ecological services provided by insects, looking at just 5 areas in the United States. And the researchers looked at pollination services, pest control services, dung burial, and wildlife nutrition. And the bottom line is that based on their estimations, insects provide $57 billion worth of ecological services just in this country alone, year in and year out. They don't do it for us. They do it for themselves. This is what they do. But when you consider the enormous ecological value of insects, doesn't it make sense to pay a little more attention to them? Doesn't it make sense to preserve their habitats, and maybe we can be preserved and conserved along with that? The 2014 National Science Medal winner, May Berenbaum, she's a very well-known doctor of entomology at the University of Illinois in Urbana. I could have shared a picture of you standing with President Obama next to her, but being all about shameless self-promotion, I chose to show it when we met. Occasionally we correspond. But she has said at a recent presentation that humans have obliviously exerted selection pressures on insects in diverse orders and changed their distributions, abundances, life histories, and physiology, with consequences ranging from increasing their ability to cause us harm to bringing their populations to the brink of extinction. That's a very powerful statement. We go about our business not thinking about insects at all and having no concept, no understanding of how we impact their lives and how that can come back to bite us, literally and figuratively. For those of you that are of a certain age in the audience, I won't say what that age is, but for those of you that might have a gray beard, like myself, you probably remember going on family trips in the 1960s, maybe the early 70s, and you couldn't go anywhere without your windshield being covered with insect goo. Remember going to gas stations when they were called service stations, and they pumped your gas, and they always washed your windshield because you couldn't see out. There were so many insects. Well, that is a phenomenon that we refer to anecdotally as the windshield phenomenon. This is something that seldom happens anymore. When I ask my students about this, it's very rare that they can recall any instances where there are more than just a couple of insect splatters on their windshield. And again, this is anecdotal, but for those of us that are old enough to remember what it used to be like, it's giving us pause. It's making us think something is going on out there. Something is impacting insect populations. In the news, we have been regaled with stories for a couple of decades now about the decline of charismatic insects. Charismatic insects are insects that people know and feel something for. I mean, let's face it. We tend to be incredibly sympathetic toward animals that look like us. They're furry, they've got shiny eyes with eyelids. Feathers are okay. Scales, well, maybe they start thinning the crowd out a little bit. Insects, they're like aliens. They are something that we are uncomfortable with at best, or just completely ignorant about at worst. But some insects, such as European honeybees and now native bees, have captured the public's attention. And we've heard of declines in European honeybee populations due to colony collapse disorder. Colony collapse disorder is something that's been going on since World War II. And just to give you the short version, it is a perfect storm of disease, parasites, pesticide use, and dramatic changes in the habitat where they can't find enough food to eat. And also our over-reliance on honeybees and moving them thousands of miles every year to pollinate crops. There are beehives in eastern United States that go to California to pollinate almonds. And if you've ever driven through central California and seen the almond orchards, there's not a darn thing around them. So until the bees are pulled out, they have nothing else to eat once those trees have passed their blossoms. And so that puts stress on bees until they're moved somewhere else. And of course, now we're starting to see that bumblebees are starting to suffer from the same sorts of diseases and parasites, although not to the same degree as honeybees. Fireflies. There's quite a bit of concern about the decline of fireflies. And I notice that people often complain or lament the disappearance of fireflies, especially when they move into new neighborhoods that have no native vegetation, that have no leaf cover on the ground. Every little scrap of plant material is picked up. There's no place for a self-respecting firefly to live or lay its eggs or have its larvae develop, or the prey, the worms and the slugs and the other beetle larvae that they eat as food. These habitats are too tidy. I'm very fortunate to live in a tract in Richmond that was built in the late 1920s, 1930s, and we have fireflies galore. We still have a very rich firefly. When you go out in the country, fireflies are still going strong in my experience, but I don't doubt that in newer developments, fireflies are not something you expect to see very often. And of course, monarch butterflies have attracted a lot of attention too, especially with in relation to their steady declines in numbers, especially at their overwintering sites. I want to spend just a moment about what monarchs are. Monarchs are tropical insects that have adapted to living in a temperate climate here in North America. And every spring, they move from the volcanic mountains of southern Mexico and hopscotch along, eventually repopulating eastern North America, as far north as southern Canada. And then the butterflies that live west of the Rocky Mountains, they migrate to the coast of California and Baja California, where they spend the winter. And again, when spring happens, they move back into the interior. After about 3 to 5 populations, the North American continent is fully repopulated again. And right now, at this time, they begin moving southward or westward, depending on where they are in relation to the Rocky Mountains. But what we've been noticing is that every Thanksgiving, there is a monarch butterfly count at their known roosts or overwintering sites along the coast of California. And you can see that their numbers have steadily declined since the late 90s. Last year, 2020, hardly any were seen at all. Now, that doesn't mean that the monarch itself is on the brink of extinction, not yet. But what it means is that the phenomenon of their overwintering behavior is at risk. There are populations of monarch butterflies in Southern California and Southern Florida and elsewhere that don't migrate. They just stay put because the climate is equitable and they can ride out the winter. Some of you may be familiar that the monarch was proposed for endangered species status, and it was shot down last year. And when I say shot down, it was decided that it was worthy of listing as either endangered or threatened, but there were other priorities that come first. There were other species that were in greater need of attention. So the jury is still out whether or not the monarch butterfly will receive federal protection. If it does, it's going to be a challenge because a lot of endangered species, certainly with insects anyway, tend to be restricted to a very small habitat. Monarchs are all over the place, and to try and afford them the same protection that's allowed by the Endangered Species Act will be a challenge. There was a paper that came out just earlier this year that looks at the dramatic decline of populations of butterflies in Western North America. Butterflies are one of the few insects that we have really good data. People have been studying butterflies for decades. If you look at a distribution map for butterflies, they're wonderfully populated with dots. If you look at a distribution map of beetles, what I work on, it's pitiful because we don't have that data available, but everybody loves butterflies. Butterflies don't suffer the stigma of being insects. People think of them as birds, and they get very excited about them. They want to learn more about them. But recent studies based on habitats and climatic information and museum studies looking at specimens indicated severe declines. So when we consider the decline of charismatic insects, it's been noted that we have a pretty good track record of ignoring everything else. We focus on these very exciting species, things that we're passionate about, things that we recognize every day, but that's a handful of species compared to the 1.5 million species of insects that are known to science. When it comes to looking at the vast majority insects, we don't even have a clue what's going on out there in terms of their populations. Recently, and this idea of insect decline is not a new one. People have been writing about insect declines ever since the colonists arrived to North America. There are papers that were written in the late 1860s talking about forests disappearing around major metropolitan areas and the decline of insects. We saw that again right after World War II. But what kicked things off recently was a very powerful study that was published in 2017, and a group of mostly amateur naturalists and entomologists in Europe, primarily in Germany, put up these traps, tent traps that are called malaise traps. It's like a tent, but the wall's on the inside, and an insect will come in and wind up in a jar, and you can see what's there. You trap these insects. So they put up these traps in a number of natural area preserves in Germany. And they did this for nearly a 30-year period. And what they discovered is that over this time, there was a 75% reduction in flying insects over the past 27 years. These traps are designed primarily to capture wasps and flies, but other insects go in them too. So a 75% reduction. But it's important to realize how they did the study. They didn't have enough experts to identify every species in these traps. That's an enormous amount of work. One jug of what I call bug soup, of a really good 2-week period, that's pretty much a year's worth of work. And if you're doing this throughout the summer or over the course of several years, that's a huge amount of work. We don't have the people, we don't have the expertise to even begin sorting those out. So what they did is they weighed the samples, and it's looking at dry weight. So the weight of the samples was decreasing. We don't know for sure whether some species were increasing and others declining, but overall there was a decline in biomass. Shortly after this article appeared, there was this very powerful story that was written up in the New York Times Magazine declaring that the insect apocalypse is here, and it had some very dramatic artwork to go along with it. There we go. And it really captures everyone's attention. And shortly after that article appeared came another scientific article that noted massive insect declines threaten the collapse of nature. Now, for those of us that are paying attention, for those of us that understand or at least have an inkling of the windshield effect, this is very chilling. It's very chilling. And they predicted in this article, or noted in this article, that there is a total global insect population decline over the past decade of 41%. That's nearly half. But this is where entomologists who have been doing this kind of work said, whoa, 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 wait a minute. We don't have that information. This is not true. We've overstepped the line as scientists, but because it makes great copy, lots of very powerful articles appeared in the popular media. If you look at a world map where the studies were done, where this idea of a 41% global decrease in insect populations occurred, look where the studies were actually set up. Primarily in Western Europe, some in North America, a few studies scattered elsewhere. The studies that you see noted in Australia and China were focused on European honeybees. So you're not even getting a snapshot of what's going on insect-wise there. So you start to get a picture that this isn't really true in terms of an insect collapse, or that we're right on the cusp of an insect collapse. We don't have that information. We don't have that data. Now, for the data that we do have, it's interesting. England, the United Kingdom, has the best known insect fauna in the world because they have been out there collecting insects and monitoring insects for over 150 years. They have a very strong tradition of amateurs going out on a regular basis and looking for insects and making collections. And the population trends that we see in the United Kingdom show a very different picture. Yes, there are some declines. Yes, there are some decreases. And yes, there are instances where different groups of insects or different orders of insects are maintaining their populations. So it's a mixed bag. This is the world's best known insect fauna. So, is there an insect apocalypse? Although recent scientific studies documenting insect population declines are cause for concern, claims of a global insect decline or apocalypse go well beyond existing scientific data. The greatest challenge to studying insect trends in diversity, abundance, range, occurrence, and other metrics is the lack of baseline data. We haven't been looking at insects in most places for very long, if at all. So we can't say whether the populations are increasing or decreasing, or the species composition is changing as a result of human activities or climate change or what have you. We don't know. We don't have the information. Studies documenting insect declines should be considered a call to action to gather more data to better understand what our impacts are on insect populations, how insect roles in the ecosystem are threatened, and the implications of insect decline on food security and the economy. That's what gets people's attention. We can talk until we're blue in the faces that it's just the right thing to do to preserve every habitat that we can in the hopes that we can save the species that are there, or at least a pocket of them. But most people don't respond to that. They respond to dollars and cents. And dollars and cents arguments are, what happens if we don't have the pollinators? What happens to our food security? And don't just think about pollinators of plants that we eat directly. Think about it, the plants that we feed to animals that we eat or that we rely on for the products they produce. They will be impacted too. So if we consider the drivers and impacts of insect decline, in other words, what are the primary causes of insect decline, at least as we understand it? There's habitat fragmentation, pollution, invasive species, climate change. Those are just a handful of some of the major drivers of insect declines around the world. Another important driver of insect decline, which has gotten a lot more attention in Europe than it has here in North America, but it's slowly catching on, is artificial light pollution. Especially LEDs. It's really sad to me to realize that LED technology has improved greatly. You've got these really bright lights that suck up a very little energy, and these lights were developed in part by studying how fireflies produce their lights. Those very same LEDs are washing out the landscape with unnecessary light, and the fireflies can't even see one another as they're signaling, and they are dwindling in urban areas. Even if they have the right habitat, because there's so much light pollution out there, they can't find one another. And what I should mention too is that it's not just not being able to see, but a lot of insects are attracted to light as night, as many of you know. And so you have these unnatural concentrations which expose these insects to injury or death. Think about a gas station or a service station out in the woods, and you have those fantastic sticky nights, and there's all kinds of insects swirling around, but they're all getting run over by cars. People are stepping on them, either accidentally or purposely. Feral cats and other animals are coming in and gobbling them up. Lights can be a real challenge for insects, to say the very least. But the greatest threat to insects, the greatest threat to all organisms, is habitat loss. And we've lost, according to Dave Coulson, we've lost huge amounts of habitat, which certainly have contributed to all these declines. I want to mention that he has just published a book, which I don't think is available just yet, but you can pre-order it. And it's sort of a follow-up to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and it's called Silent Earth. And it's what is happening around the planet in terms of the decline of insects and the organisms that are impacted directly by this decline, including ourselves. Conversion of natural land for agricultural, residential, and commercial development is the primary mechanism by which habitat is lost permanently. Without careful planning, this conversion results in decentralized and scattered patterns that consume excessive amounts of land as a result of the edge effect, thus fragmenting landscape. I'll talk more about the edge effect momentarily. Land conversion results not only in the loss of habitat and natural corridors that connect them, but also the degradation of important ecosystem services that keep our air and water clean, assist in climate regulation, and reduce impacts of natural disasters. If we look at a map of Virginia, you can start to see the fragmented nature of our habitats. This map here is keyed very simply. Green is forest and woodland, yellow is agricultural vegetation, and I don't know what color that is anymore, beigey, are developed areas. Well, if you just sort of look at Virginia, you think, well, it doesn't look too bad. Most of it's kind of green, right? But forest and woodland cover is no indication as to the quality of that habitat. A pine plantation looks like that on a map. It's going to show up green. An old field that's just been left fallow and is coming up with all kinds of invasive plants, that's going to show up green too. So we need to refine our lens just a bit more. So these are maps that are available online with various state agencies. Here's Virginia's Natural Landscape Assessment, and this is where you start to see the difference in quality of habitat. Red is the best. Those are where you see the best habitats, the least disturbed habitats, the habitats that are still capable of preserving high concentrations of species, plants and animals. And you'll notice that most of these habitats occur in the Appalachians, the mountain chains. Here's the Great Dismal Swamp right there. And you'll see a couple of patches scattered around here and there, followed by yellow, which is very good, and green, which is good. So it doesn't look too bad, but now you really see the fragmented nature of Virginia's landscape. Okay, sort of keep in mind where those red and yellow areas are. Let's look at another map. Here's a map showing the areas that are managed for conservation. These are lands that are preserved in order to keep intact and preserve wildlife, preserve our watersheds, etc. Most of the land that is managed for conservation in Virginia is owned by the federal government, and that's in terms of national forests, national parks, and national wildlife preserves. Then it's followed by state lands. State parks certainly come to mind, but not all of them are managed totally for conservation, but parts of them certainly are. Natural area preserves, which are run by the state. If you ever have a chance to see natural area preserve, they're incredible. Even wildlife management areas, which are not necessarily managed for wildlife, they're managed for hunting. But still, they have habitat that are useful to native animals. And then you have the Virginia Outdoors Foundation. There are local cities that have their own parks and strips of land that they manage too. So, but now you really see the fragmented nature of Virginia's landscape. Fragmented natural lands are ecologically similar to islands surrounded by water. Fragmented natural lands are isolated from one another by distance and surrounding predominant land cover. We call that the matrix. The matrix can consist of agriculture, it can consist of parking lots, residential areas, commercial development, what have you. It's whatever's in the middle, what separates these natural areas, that's the matrix. Individual organisms may or may not cross surrounding matrices to reach other fragments. This is critical because sooner or later some fragments are just too small to support any wildlife. And even if it could, that doesn't mean that wildlife will get there. Think of birds. Most people are more familiar with birds. There are a lot of birds that won't fly across wide open areas. They don't fly across water. They won't fly across these matrices. And if they do, as with insects, they are exposed to all kinds of hazards. Decreased genetic exchange between populations living in fragments may lead to inbreeding. Healthy populations in isolated patches are vulnerable to extirpation, that's local extinction, due to extreme weather, disease outbreaks, or excessive predation. When these areas are so small, there's no protection, there's no buffer from the outside world. This is part of what we call the edge effect. Isolated patches are less likely to be recolonized by previously extirpated species due to the unsuitability of their surrounding matrices. In other words, you could build the island, but they won't necessarily come. So what do? What we have to do is build networks. By creating networks of natural lands that are interconnected by corridors and patches, offsets the negative consequences of fragmentation. Landscape corridors increase exchange of animals among patches and facilitate dispersal of pollen and seeds. Landscape corridors are valuable tools for conservation of biodiversity. I'm sure you've all had that experience where you're driving through agricultural areas and farmers, rightly so, want to get as much as they can out of their land, but they can't manage or do much with what's right along the creeks. And so that's where native vegetation continues to grow. Those serve as natural corridors that connect species with larger habitats. Corridors make use of small pieces of habitat, we call those nodes, that act as stepping stones to facilitate movement among patches. Think of them as like an archipelago, a series of islands, chains of islands that connect to much larger natural areas. So corridors and nodes together allow multiple patches and fragmented landscapes to function as if they were part of a larger, more continuous preserve. So you still have this patchwork, but because they're connected in some way, animals and plants can still move around as if it was an entire larger piece of much more pristine land. At the University of Richmond, they've created the Gambles Mill Eco Corridor. And what they've done is they've taken this little strip right here, which is along the Westham Creek, and it drains these residential areas here. This is the university campus. This is the Virginia Country Club here. There's the James River there. So what they've done is restored this section of the creek and replanted it with native plants, and it serves as a corridor to assist wildlife from getting to these more fragmented areas here down to the James River, which is a much larger corridor that moves east and west. And this is a great opportunity because the continued study of this system and its effects are prime examples of engaged scholarship with potential to inform real-world practices. In other words, professors and students can go out there, study the trends that are going on in this habitat restoration project, which is long-term, and gain a valuable experience that they can then go out and take out into the world and apply to other similar restoration projects. Just as an aside, there was a study published in Germany where they took just little strips in parking areas and little vacant lots here and there all around Munich. They realized that they had a severe decline in the native bee population. And within 2 years, the bees were back. And they were just in these little strips that were planted with native plants, natives where the flowers are blooming throughout the year. It doesn't take much land to support insects, even in urban and suburban areas. I've introduced you to Doug Tallamy before, and I found one of his earlier books, Bringing Nature Home, really got my attention. I listened to him give a lecture, and I got to talk with him a little bit. And his thesis in part is that birds are incredibly dependent upon insects to feed to their young. They need extraordinary amounts of protein in the form of insect bodies. And he rightly noted that almost everybody wants to have birds in their yard. People can get excited about birds. They put out feeders and bird baths and all kinds of things to attract birds. But he's making the point that if you don't have insects in your yard and adjacent yards, you're not going to have many birds sticking around very long, and you certainly won't have them nesting. I've done my own attempt at home to bring insects back home. I've always thought mowing lawns is stupid. I grew up in the West where it's dry and you just don't have lawns. And if you do have a lawn, animals come and gobble it up for you, depending on where you live. So I was not keen on coming here and mowing a lawn. There's a lot of grass in this part of the world. But I did it for 17 years. It took me that long. And I finally removed the front lawn. And then 2 years later, I removed the back lawn. And my wife and I are now in the process of replacing all that vegetation with native plants. And we have a rain garden. I don't like gardening. I don't get any pleasure out of it. I get tremendous amounts of pleasure walking out there and it's already done. And the bugs are there. When you see me working in the garden, that's displacement behavior. I have a manuscript deadline that's bearing down on me, or I've got papers to grade. That's what gets me out in the garden. Lose the lawn. Consider the following. Continental United States has more than 40 million acres of residential and commercial grass that in terms of acreage is equivalent to America's 4th largest crop, wheat. And what do we do with it? Not a darn thing. We cut it off and throw it away. Or we cover it in chemicals so other insects don't come along, usually invasive, gobble it up. It's just a waste of time and energy. Computer simulations project that all of the nation's lawns demand about 200 gallons of potable water per person per day. Now here in the East, I admit, when we usually have plenty of rain, although we've had some droughts here in the recent past, that doesn't seem to be a big issue. But in the West, it is a huge issue. Every summer, Americans spill 17 million gallons of gasoline when refueling mowers and garden equipment. Of the 90 million American households with a yard or garden, half of them use chemical fertilizers and half of them use insecticides or chemicals to control weeds. That is an enormous burden that's placed on the environment. If you can't bring yourself to get rid of the lawn, and I know I'm talking pretty radical here, but if you can't bring yourself to getting rid of the entire lawn, consider moving just chunks of it. Just work along a driveway or along the edge of a yard or a walkway, and think of grass rather than covering or blanketing everything. Just make it a meandering path that guides you to one patch of native plants after another. Encourage pollinators by going native. And when I'm saying pollinators, don't think about European honeybees. It makes no sense to focus on European honeybees. Focusing on European honeybees to save pollinators is like growing chickens to say you're conserving birds. Be smart. European honeybees arrived in North America with the colonists are essential pollinators for agriculture. The majority of North America's 4,000 native bee species are solitary. They nest in wood or soil, and they're essential pollinators for both agriculture and native plants. About 70% of North America's native bees are solitary ground nesters. This is when I start getting calls in the spring. Suddenly there's a lot of bee activity, these little mounds show up, and people are going, what do I do? What do I do? Nothing. 2 weeks later, they'll be gone. There's nothing to do. Consider yourself fortunate to have something going on like that in your yard. You're doing your part. About 30% of North America's native bees nest in wood tunnels. So snags, log stumps riddled with wood borer holes, and plants with pithy stems that can be hollowed out provide nesting habitats for mason and leafcutter bees, among others. In other words, don't be so tidy. Leave a few things behind, because that's habitat for wildlife, especially insects. Butterfly gardens. A lot of people can get behind butterfly gardens because, again, butterflies don't suffer the stigma of being insects. We think of them as birds. And one of the popular plants in butterfly gardens that's regularly sold at many nurseries is buddleia, butterfly bush. Butterfly bush is native to China and Japan. It's an attractive source of nectar for butterflies, but not one North American species utilizes it as a larval food source. No caterpillars, no butterflies. If you want to get going with an insect garden, but you still want to aim it toward butterflies, think caterpillar garden. Create diverse plant architecture by planting native herbs, vines, shrubs, and trees. You want a lot of different shapes and sizes and heights to really mix it up, where there's a lot of habitat there. Plant native plants that feed caterpillars to attract both butterflies, moths, and birds. Lose the lawn, leave the leaves. Some of you may be thrilled about this because it's getting that time that the trees are going to drop their leaves, and you think, oh, I got to rake them up again. And what do you do with them? You throw them away. Don't. It's habitat. Leaf litter provides shelter for all kinds of wildlife and is a free source of mulch, fertilizer, weed control, and soil amendments. Leaf litter soaks up rain and holds moisture in the soil, while bare ground and lawns do not, save for those little patches you're saving for the bees. Neat edging and clean paths give seemingly unkempt leaf litter a more managed appearance. That's what happens in our yard. We have very tolerant neighbors, I will admit. In fact, some of them have gotten on board, and we've got several native plant gardens sprouting up all over North Side and Richmond. I think Doug Tallamy's inscription in my book says it all. Garden as if life depends on it. We have to raise the bar on our landscapes. In the past, we have asked one thing of our gardens, that they be pretty. Now they have to support life, sequester carbon, feed pollinators, and manage water. We have a real opportunity with the Virginia Museum of Natural History Waynesboro campus, in that not only can we have wonderful educational exhibits inside the building, we can create an educational opportunity outside the building with a rain garden that focuses on native plants, at least in sections, so people can see what can be done and the benefits of creating these gardens, and also explore ideas about less intrusive external lighting, which will save all of us money in the future. So back to my original question. Is the world's entomofauna in decline? I think you already know the answer. It's complicated. Our current knowledge of global insect diversity is too limited to support strong negative messaging about global patterns in insect population dynamics. Very little is known about most insects, and millions of species await discovery and description. This is something that's often lost on people who don't have a background in biology, and understandably so. There are millions of species of insects that we just haven't described yet. We know they're out there. They're in museum collections. We haven't made them known to science yet. As a society, we need to recognize that insects are an essential part of the ecosystem, support research that examines insect populations and biodiversity over time in all habitats, disturbed and wild. And one of the premier institutions that does that right here in Virginia is the Virginia Museum of Natural History. We have a top-notch curatorial team there and research collections. This is what they do. And it's important that we as a society support institutions like this and enable them to do this critical job of monitoring insects and other wildlife. Here are some of our research priorities that we need to focus on to fill in our knowledge gaps. We need to develop knowledge of global diversity, species ecology, and life history. We need greater support for online collections, that is, having photographs of specimens in museums that researchers can access around the world to facilitate their work on all aspects of entomology. User-friendly identification initiatives. Master Naturalist, iNaturalist, has shown that there's a real thirst among people who don't necessarily have biology backgrounds that want to know more about nature. They want to be able to identify the species they have around them. And also we need to find more cost-efficient genetic tools and better integrate those tools with traditional surveys. That is, looking at tissue samples and help us to identify populations of species. Communicating science is incredibly important. The role of science is to accurately document and understand variation in patterns and processes, not to produce absolute truths. Communication in science focuses on engagement and dialogue and discusses uncertainty relative to the needs and beliefs of the audience rather than fact-based enlightenment. I think you can, just looking at the news today, you can see we have a real crisis in terms of people's comfort level or ability to embrace science. Science is there to serve us. It can help us. And so many people today don't trust it or just ignore it altogether, and we do so at our peril. Accuracy in science requires discussing uncertainty. We don't know everything. We don't have all the answers. But uncertainty is not a valid argument for doing nothing to reduce harm. Responsibility for accuracy lies with the stakeholders. That's you, me, that's our institutions, those are our journalists, and everybody out there in the audience. Ambiguous or misleading language in scientific and popular communications is potentially harmful to policy decisions and for public engagement. Accurate and appropriate use of terminology describing insect population trends in all communications is essential for garnering public support of insect conservation goals. When evaluating whether or not the phrase insect decline is appropriately applied in scientific and popular articles, consider these following points. What is the taxonomic scale of the evidence? In other words, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about beetles? Are we talking about butterflies and moths, grasshoppers? What is it that we're looking at? What is the spatial scale of the evidence? Is it a local study? Is it a regional? Is it a national? Remember, we don't have global data. It's not there. So when you see sensational titles that talk about a global decline, that's a red flag right there. They're trying to get your attention and elicit a gut reaction, and that doesn't serve anyone. The purpose of the study. The purpose of any scientific study should be to support insect decline. The purpose of the study should be looking at general population trends and dynamics and the impacts of those environmental drivers that I brought up. In other words, we're looking to see what's going on. We're not going in with a preconceived idea that insects are declining and then focusing on the things that support that hypothesis. That's not how science works. It's not how it should work. And then finally, what are the framing of the results? Does the title clearly state the time frame or the long-term trends? That article I showed you about the German study, it clearly lays out in the abstract what the time period was. It also clearly laid out in the abstract what the geographical spread was, or the spatial focus of the study. That's critical in understanding and knowing how to interpret the data that's presented. A group of European scientists last year got together and put together a roadmap to insect recovery and conservation. And they have things that we can do immediately, things that we can do midterm and long-term actions. I just want to take a moment to focus on what we can do right now, because we know everything we need to know. Remember, uncertainty is not an excuse for doing nothing to prevent harm. Right now, we can start reducing light, water, and noise pollution. Right now, we can phase out pesticide use and replace with ecological measures such as predators and parasites and that sort of thing. Reduce imports of ecologically harmful products. That goes for plants too. There are plants that the state is trying to remove from our natural areas that are still for sale at nurseries and big box stores, and the big companies say, well, people like them, they buy them. And the only reason we sell them is because they buy them. You know, there's a disconnect there in understanding what is going on and what is at stake. The conservation of threatened species, enhanced restoration and conservation programs, education for awareness, citizen science, and capacity building. These are things we can do right now. The bottom line is that as a society, we need to recognize that insects are an essential part of the ecosystem, support research that examines insect populations and biodiversity over time in all habitats, disturbed and natural, and minimize or eliminate drivers that negatively impact insect populations. And we need to support the development of corridors and nodes landscaped with native plants. You've got a corridor with the river right here through town. And I apologize, I'm ignorant of this area. You may have something that's going on here to take advantage of that natural corridor. And if you do, kudos. If you don't, here's an opportunity to connect the Virginia Museum of Natural History Waynesboro campus with that corridor and get people thinking about what are the possibilities. Uncertainty is not a valid argument for doing nothing. Okay, I'm going to jump off my soapbox here for a minute, and I want to focus on a real-world project that's going on right now here in Virginia, and this is the Virginia Cicada Project. One of the first steps in conserving insects or any organism is figuring out what's there. Is there a list? Do we know what's there? Do we know where they are? And I've always had an interest in cicadas, and just in my effort to learn more about them. So I've teamed up with the staff of the Virginia Museum of Natural History in Martinsville, and the four of us are working on the Virginia Cicada Project, and we're going to turn it into a fascicle of the Insects of Virginia series. This is a series of publications that's available on the Virginia Museum of Natural History's website that focuses on different groups of insects in Virginia. And we want to, hopefully by the end of next year, that might be a little ambitious, have the next fascicle on the cicadas of Virginia. Who cares? I mean, cicadas, if you lived where the 17-year cicadas were emerging, you probably thought they were a nuisance, maybe because they're so loud, there's so many of them. And now we've got the annual cicadas that are going strong right now. But cicadas are incredibly important. That sudden flushing of millions of 17-year cicadas every few years is an enormous enrichment of the environment. Those cicadas provide food for all kinds of organisms, and their densities are mind-boggling in some areas. And so understanding the energy flow in a particular habitat as it relates to cicadas can be very important. Cicadas can be used as bioindicators, whether the species is a 17-year cicada or it's an annual cicada that just has a life cycle of 2 or 5 years. Most of their lives are spent in the ground sucking sap out of tree roots. And because they are in the ground so long, they're exposed to pollutants in the soil. And by learning how those pollutants impact their development, impact their morphology, we can get a handle on what's going on underground. They can be the cicadas in the soil, the canaries in the coal mine that help give us a look, provide us with a magnifying glass into an area that's very little studied. And yet, all the water that we depend on is percolating through that soil, and yet we don't understand all of the systems and drivers that impact that water flowing through those soils. Cicadas can help us do that. Cicadas and biomimetics. Remember I mentioned biomimetics is copying nature to find inspiring designs. The wings of cicadas are really amazing. When you put them under high power magnification, they have these nanostructures that look like little pillars, little spikes on their wings, those clear membranous wings. If you put them under high magnification, they're spiky. And those spikes do a number of different things. It makes them super hydrophobic. In other words, water just sheets right off. They're self-cleaning, they're anti-reflective. Think about putting a similar film on a solar reflector or a handheld device where you don't want the sun, shining back in your face. We're already doing this with other insect-inspired technologies, but cicadas can provide new insights. And so this is just tip of the iceberg of what cicadas might reveal with their studies. So let's find out more about them. This paper came out in 2013, and it looks like the biogeography of cicadas in North America. There are roughly 120, 130 species, don't quote me on that, across the United States and Canada. We have 24 species of cicadas here in Virginia. 6 of them are periodical cicadas. That means that they either come out every 13 or every 17 years. Of course, this year was a big year for 17-year cicadas because brood 10 emerged, and everybody in Richmond was really disappointed because we didn't have any. In fact, in most places in Virginia, you didn't have any, unless you lived in Northern Virginia or in extreme Southwest Virginia. But brood 10 is the largest population that exists from Cincinnati all the way to Baltimore and also parts south. And a brood is simply a population that has this massive synchronized emergence. They all come up at once. Here in cicada, we have 5 broods that come up every 17 years. And 1 brood comes up every 13 years. And every time a 13 or 17-year brood emerges, there's actually 3 species that are part of this emergence. You can tell them physically, and they also have very different calls too. Here's a map showing the periodical cicadas across eastern United States. This is an American phenomenon. We've found only recently there are cicadas that have 5 or 8-year emergence cycles in other parts of the world. This is only very recently. But the 13 and 17-year cicadas right here in eastern United States, that's it. This isn't going on anywhere else in the world. So I'm involved with collecting cicadas myself. I've been coordinating with master naturalist groups. My students at Randolph-Macon and University of Richmond are collecting fresh, perfect specimens for extra credit. And we're going to put some more dots on the map for Virginia. I've already processed probably 300 to 400 specimens of cicadas, maybe about 3/4 of the species we have here. There's still species I have yet to collect, but I think the Virginia Museum of Natural History has all but 1 species recorded from Virginia in their collection. So we have a good reference collection. I've talked enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Art. That was great, very informative. Does anybody have any questions for Art? I'll bring the microphone to you if you want to ask any questions, comments.
You want people to collect cicadas?
Not this late. We've got an abundance of the cicadas that are out now, late summer. What we're looking for now are 2 species that come out in the spring, and one of them is in the mountains, one of them is along the coast. So after 3 years of getting great responses from people, I'm getting very picky right now. But if you're still interested in participating, you can go to my Facebook page, Dr. Art Ivins, Entomologist, and there's a button there that says Email Now. And you're welcome just to email me directly, and if you have questions or interest, and I'd be happy to talk with you.
Do you have interest in the casings? Because I let them go, but I've collected the casings.
You know, it's interesting you brought that up. The casings or the shells or the exuvia, as we call them, the shed exoskeleton, the nymph. No, I've not been collecting those. However, when I can authoritatively connect the species with the shell, I do collect it. But when I'm just collecting shells, right now there's no key for identification to separate them. But if I can see an adult emerging and I can identify that adult, I'll hang on to that because that's useful information. But we're not that sophisticated yet.
Yeah, I probably don't need that.
That's for the recording.
Oh, I noticed this year you didn't have any dots for the 17-year locust in this area, but
That was for brood 10.
I know, for brood 10. There was a lot of them in this area.
This is an old map. Now,
Gotcha.
in my defense, John Cooley, who's at the University of Connecticut.
I know who he is.
Okay. So he's been gathering it, and when we do the final publication, I hope to work with him and get his latest data. Because yes, there were more dots added to the map in places that we hadn't seen them before or hadn't seen them in a long time. You're absolutely right.
Other questions? Yep.
Thank you, Dr. Evans, for your presentation.
Thank you.
I'm glad that you made the comments that you did more than once, that the global almost hysteria about the decline in insects is really hopefully premature. But there is a worry about pollination. Mm-hmm. And if we just limit our concerns to the pollinators, is there a reason to be concerned for our food supply, for agriculture at large?
Absolutely.
Can you amplify that a little bit?
Well, I touched on colony collapse disorder for the European honeybee. We're absolutely dependent on European honeybees for the pollination of our crops. And that includes stone fruits, truck crops, you name it. If it's got a flower on it, with some exceptions, melons, squash, there are other bees that do that. Honeybees are not the best pollinators for that. But honeybees are overloaded because we are incredibly reliant upon them. We're bringing more crops online, and yet we're struggling to meet the demand with the hives that are available to pollinate these crops. And like I say, we have to truck bees around. This is what beekeepers do. Honey is way down the end of the list. Wax production is way down the list. It's renting out their hives as pollinators is where they make their money, and they have to truck them thousands of miles in order to do that every year to follow the crop cycle.
So is it a decline or a failure for a robust population of the necessary pollinator?
The bees themselves, the honeybees, are struggling with pesticides, parasites, a virus, and lack of decent habitat in order to sustain themselves when the crops stop blooming. And the total reliance on European honeybees ignores the role that native bees have. And people are now starting to get on board that native bees are important too, and they're solitary. We can't keep them in hives. Many of them we can't manage. Some we do to a limited extent. We use bumblebees. The Scandinavians have developed greenhouses that rely on bumblebee pollination because bumblebees are much better pollinators of solanaceous crops, peppers, tomatoes, eggplants, that kind of thing. But yeah, we're flat out in trouble. I mean, we're on the brink, but you don't hear anybody talking about it.
Two quick questions. The native bees, are they under the same stress as the cultivated pollinators, the European honeybees?
They're under the same stress in that the plants they depend on for pollen and nectar are disappearing with their habitats. So their habitats are constantly shrinking. And also in urban areas and in the Midwest, for example, where natural habitats have been almost completely replaced with crops. Agricultural lands are like food deserts for pollinators. And so somehow we have to counteract that. And intercropping is one way of doing that, where in between rows of your cash crop, you're planting something else that you're not necessarily going to harvest, but it's providing food and shelter for native bees and naturally occurring predators and parasites that once they get going, they will naturally go into your cash crop and exact control on the pests that may be causing you problems.
Thank you.
There's a question over here.
Thank you very much for your talk. I don't have a question. I just wanted to point something out when you're talking about corridors and native plants and so forth. What we have noticed is that flowering plants as well as honey feeders for birds attract a lot of Hymenoptera, and they're not honeybees. And sedum, for instance, is a plant that produces, we get lots of Hymenoptera, but very few honeybees. But the flowering plants have really done a great job of bringing in these insects.
It's true, and when we think about pollinators, the point I was trying to make earlier is that honeybees, European honeybees, I want to emphasize that. This is a species that's not indigenous to the United States. We brought them in the 1600s, and they're scattered all around the world, and the crops that come from the old world too are absolutely dependent upon European honeybees for their pollination. There's no question about that. But native plants, honeybees are not necessarily good pollinators of native plants, and we can't just think about bees. Native bees are incredibly important. Bees are at the top of the list as pollinators, and that includes European honeybees, native bees, everything. Bees are top of the list. But we also, the second most important pollinators out there, which we're only beginning to understand, are flies. And behind flies are wasps. And so all those visitors to various flowers, if they're regular visitors, all of them are potential pollinators. Now some insects are better pollinators than others. If you consider the fuzzy insects, they're like pollen magnets, which most bees are. But there are other species of insects that still, because of what they do, pollen packets will cling to their bodies, and as they fly along, they will transfer that pollen. So you've got a collection, a diversity of insects that pollinate plants overall. Some of them are spectacular pollinators, some of them not so much, but we need all of them. There's that classic analogy that, if you're in a plane at 37,000 feet, and you lose a rivet, are you concerned? How many rivets do you lose before you think, oh my gosh? Well, think of a rivet as a species. How many species do we have to lose? How many habitats have to be irreversibly destroyed before we start thinking, wait a minute, we're in trouble here? But nobody's talking about this. I am not a politician, and it's very rare that you'll hear a politician even mention any of this. And if they do, depending on where they are, they're not going to get many votes, because people are more concerned about, other important things. We've got a lot of important things going on right now, but the very basis for our food security is nature. We depend on nature for so many things, and we're ignoring the importance of that, and insects are such an important part of that. I don't even know if I even came close to addressing what your point was. But don't despair that, if you're planting flowers and other insects are coming, that's great. We have very few honeybees in our neighborhood, which is fine by me. But we've got lots of other things that are indigenous to that area, and they are coming, and it's a treat to have them there. Bugs are welcome.
Any other questions or comments? Again, thank you, Dr. Evans, for a great presentation. I always learn something really great when I come to these events, and today was no exception, so thank you so much for coming. If you would like to suggest a program, if there's something that's kind of burning inside that you'd like to have us address here, we'd really love to hear from you. Jenna will be manning a table out there in the lobby with a sign-up sheet. If you've got some topics or suggestions for programs, please stop by, mention them to Jenna so we can add them to the list, and we'll certainly get them on the schedule. I hope you found tonight to be very interesting. I certainly did. And thank you again for making the trip here, and thank you all for coming out tonight, and I hope to see you here next month. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.